My father was a man who belonged to the woods. We lived in a completely isolated off-grid cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains, miles away from any paved road or civilization. Getting anywhere meant walking. We had no vehicles of any kind, not even a rusted frame on the property. Our lives were measured in footsteps, in the miles of rough dirt trails we hiked daily to forage, hunt, and survive. But in the late autumn of 1993, the woods took him. One afternoon, he simply walked out the heavy oak door of our cabin to check some snares about 3 miles north of our property, and he never came back. I was only 12 years old at the time, left alone with a paralyzing silence that stretched for days. The authorities eventually hiked up, scoured a few square miles, and officially gave up, writing it off as a tragic accident. But I knew better. Even as a child, I felt an oppressive, malevolent shadow hanging over the tree line, a dark weight that convinced me he had not simply fallen or gotten lost. Years passed, but the hollow ache in my chest never faded. I'm a grown man now, hardened by time, but the mystery of his vanishing remained an open wound. It was not until just last month, decades after the fact, that I decided to return to those exact same coordinates on foot. I packed a heavy canvas bag, laced up my boots, and hiked the grueling 10 miles up the mountain from the nearest outpost. The temperature was dropping fast, hovering around 40 degrees, and the icy wind cut right through my layers. The forest had barely changed. The ancient pines still towered 100 feet into the grey sky, their thick canopies blocking out the dying sunlight. The isolation was immediate and absolute. I was looking for closure, for a bone, for a rusted belt buckle, anything to finally put my father to rest. Instead, I found a nightmare that proved whatever took my father all those years ago was still out there, and he had been waiting for me to come back. The deeper I hiked into the dense timber, the more the atmosphere shifted. It was an unnatural transition. Usually a forest is alive with movement. You notice birds darting between branches, squirrels scrambling up bark, and the rustle of small wildlife in the underbrush. But as I passed the 2-mile mark past our old abandoned cabin site, all of that vanished. A suffocating silence draped over the woods like a heavy wool blanket. The air grew stagnant, and the temperature seemed to plummet another 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. Every footstep I took against the dead leaves sounded aggressively loud, echoing through the timber like a warning. I kept my eyes fixed on the uneven terrain, navigating the steep inclines and dodging the massive roots that protruded from the soil. I was heading toward a specific ridge, a rocky outcrop that my father used to call the dead zone. He always warned me to stay away from it, claiming the terrain was too treacherous. But as I reviewed his old handwritten maps recently, I realized his snares were set directly on the border of that exact ridge. As I closed the distance, a foul scent hit the back of my throat. It was a potent, gag-inducing odor, like a mixture of rotten meat and wet, filthy hair. I pulled my collar up over my nose, trying to block the stench, but it was heavy and clinging to the damp air. The feeling of being watched washed over me. It was not a subtle suspicion. It was an intense, primal instinct screaming that eyes were fixed on the back of my neck. I stopped walking and slowly scanned the tree line, but there was nothing except the endless rows of decaying pine trunks fading into the shadows. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing through the thick ferns that reached up to my waist. About 50 feet ahead, the ground sloped downward into a dark, muddy ravine. The stench grew even stronger here, almost unbearable. I carefully slid down the slick embankment, my boots sinking a couple of inches into the dark mud. That was when I saw the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, and the sheer size of them made my blood run cold. They were not human, and they absolutely did not belong to a bear. The prints were canine in shape, but massive, easily 14 inches long and heavily clawed, with a stride that suggested a bipedal creature. I knelt down in the dirt, my hands trembling as I measured the distance between the steps. Whatever left these tracks walked on 2 legs and had to be over 8 feet tall. The pressure exerted into the mud meant he was impossibly heavy, carrying hundreds of pounds of pure muscle. As I traced the trajectory of the footprints, I realized they were leading directly toward the rocky face of the ridge. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and followed the trail. The prints were fresh. Water was still slowly pooling into the indentations, meaning he had walked through this ravine just minutes before I arrived. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I was totally unarmed, isolated miles away from any help, tracking a massive male beast that clearly dominated this territory. My rational mind told me to turn around, to hike the miles back to civilization and never look back. But the desperate need to find out what happened to my father propelled my legs forward against my own will. The trail of massive footprints ended abruptly at the base of the stone ridge, disappearing onto solid rock. I stood at the bottom of the steep cliff face, my eyes scanning the jagged grey stone. Concealed behind a thick cluster of dead, thorny brush was an opening. It was a dark, jagged fissure in the side of the mountain, measuring roughly 6 feet wide and 10 feet high. The entrance looked like an open, jagged mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The horrific stench of death was pouring directly out of this black void, carried by a cold, damp draft that brushed against my face. I reached into my bag and pulled out my heavy-duty flashlight, clicking it on. The beam of light sliced through the gloom, but was quickly swallowed by the sheer depth of the cavern. The walls were uneven and slick with a strange, dark moisture. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. This was the exact area my father had vanished. If there was any evidence left of his final moments, it had to be inside. I slowly pushed through the dead branches, the thorns tearing at my clothes, and crossed the threshold into the cave. The immediate drop in temperature was shocking. It felt like walking into a meat locker. The silence of the outside forest was replaced by the slow, rhythmic dripping of water echoing from deep within the belly of the mountain. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, warning me that I had just entered the den of an apex predator. I moved cautiously, placing each foot precisely to avoid slipping on the wet, uneven stone floor. The tunnel descended gradually, winding deeper into the rock. After walking about 200 feet into the total darkness, the narrow passage opened up into a massive, cavernous chamber. I swept my flashlight across the space. The ceiling arched high above, at least 30 feet up, and the floor was littered with absolute horrors. The ground was covered in hundreds of bones. Most belonged to large deer and elk, their femurs and ribs snapped in half and sucked clean of marrow. I gagged as the smell peaked, my eyes watering from the concentrated ammonia and decay. I panned the light toward the far corner of the chamber, and the beam caught something synthetic, something that did not belong in nature. Partially buried under a pile of dried dirt and shattered rib cages was a piece of fabric. I moved closer, my breath hitching in my throat. I recognized the faded red plaid pattern instantly. It was my father's heavy winter jacket. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the filth and the bones, and pulled the fabric from the debris. It was stiff, heavily stained with dark, dried blood, and massive rents were torn completely through the thick material, as if massive claws had shredded it effortlessly. Tears blurred my vision as I held the jacket, the reality of his brutal end finally crashing down on me. But my grief was instantly shattered. From the darkest, unseen corner of the cavern, a deep, rumbling vibration began to echo against the stone walls. It was a heavy, rhythmic breathing. I slowly turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated a pair of massive amber eyes suspended nearly 9 feet off the ground, staring directly down at me. He was there in the dark, my entire body locked up, paralyzed by a primal terror that I had never experienced before. The amber eyes, staring down at me from the darkness, were filled with a terrifying, calculated malice. He was not a mindless animal acting on instinct. There was a dark intelligence behind that gaze, a profound awareness that he had me trapped perfectly in his domain. The heavy, rhythmic breathing echoing through the damp cavern sounded like a massive bellows pushing air through a furnace. I knew that if I turned my back and ran, my life would end in that filthy cave just like my father's did. Operating entirely on survival instinct, I slowly began to walk backward. I kept my flashlight aimed directly at his face, refusing to break eye contact. The beam illuminated the terrifying silhouette of his massive, muscular shoulders and the thick, coarse black hair covering his chest. He stood completely still, his 9-foot frame towering in the shadows, simply watching me retreat. It was as if he was enjoying the fear radiating from my body, relishing the power he held over my life. Every backward step felt like walking through thick mud. The wet stone floor was treacherous, and I prayed I would not trip over the scattered bones of his past victims. I clutched my father's torn jacket tightly against my chest, the dried blood rough against my hands. As I finally crossed the threshold and stepped back out into the freezing forest air, the creature did not pursue. He stayed hidden in the black depths of the mountain, waiting. He knew he did not need to rush. I was 10 miles deep in his territory, and the sun was beginning to set. To truly understand the absolute dread of my situation, you have to understand the environment of the deep Cascade Mountains. This is not a friendly, sunlit woodland where people go for a casual afternoon hike. The wilderness here is dense, unforgiving, and completely indifferent to human life. The ancient pine trees grow well over 100 feet tall, their massive branches interlocking to form a thick canopy that blocks out the sky and plunges the forest floor into a permanent, gloomy twilight. We lived entirely off the grid, relying solely on walking to navigate the harsh terrain. There were no dirt roads, no power lines, and absolutely no way to call for help. The nearest sign of human life was a small, rugged outpost exactly 10 miles away by foot, a grueling trek through steep ravines and thick underbrush. The temperature was dropping aggressively, now sitting at a bitter 30 degrees, and the icy wind felt like needles against my skin. The smell of the forest is something that stays with you forever, a mixture of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp scent of pine sap. But all of those natural odors were now completely overpowered by the lingering, sickening stench of the creature. Standing outside that cave, the isolation of the mountains crushed down on me. There was no rescue coming. There was no shelter. I was entirely alone in a vast ocean of timber, and the only thing standing between me and safety was a 10-mile walk through the darkest, most dangerous woods on the continent. My father was not a man who made mistakes in the wilderness. He was a master tracker, someone who could read a disturbed patch of dirt or a broken twig and tell you exactly what had passed through and when. He taught me everything I knew about survival, about respecting the deep woods and the unseen boundaries we shared with the apex predators. That was why his disappearance in 1993 never made sense to me. The authorities claimed he got turned around, suffered from exposure, and perished. But a man with his skills does not just get lost a mere 3 miles from his own cabin. As I stood trembling in the freezing wind, clutching his ruined jacket, the old local legends finally made terrifying sense. The few off-grid dwellers who inhabited the outer edges of the mountains used to speak in hushed, frightened tones about the dogman. They described him exactly as I had just seen him, a massive bipedal canine beast that claimed the deepest ridges of the Cascades. They said he was fiercely territorial, a giant male creature that possessed the raw strength of a grizzly, but the cunning mind of a human hunter. He did not kill out of hunger alone. He killed to dominate. My father must have inadvertently crossed into the beast's core territory while checking his snare lines, and the creature eliminated him for the transgression. The realization that my father, a man I viewed as invincible, was easily overwhelmed and dragged into that dark mountain fissure made my stomach turn. The psychological horror of encountering the dogman is far worse than the physical threat. It is the sudden, violent shattering of your place in the food chain. As human beings, we walk through the woods with a false sense of security, believing our intelligence makes us the ultimate masters of our environment. But when you lock eyes with a 9-foot-tall monster that walks on 2 legs, all of that arrogance evaporates in a split second. You realize you are nothing but prey. Based on the massive 14-inch footprints I had measured in the mud, I knew he could cover ground twice as fast as I could. His stride was immense, and his heavily clawed feet were designed to grip the uneven, rocky terrain effortlessly. I had no weapons, no heavy blade, nothing to defend myself against hundreds of pounds of aggressive muscle and razor-sharp teeth. The anxiety was a physical weight pressing against my chest, making it difficult to pull the freezing air into my lungs. My mind raced with horrifying scenarios, picturing him bursting from the dense ferns or dropping down from the high branches above. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of suspense. Every shadow stretching across the dead leaves looked like his towering silhouette. The woods had transformed from the familiar backyard of my childhood into a massive, inescapable hunting ground, and I was entirely exposed. The daylight was failing rapidly, draining the last remaining color from the forest and leaving everything in shades of gray and black. The temperature plummeted further, settling around 25 degrees, and my breath materialized in thick white clouds before my face. I knew I had to move. Staying near the ridge was a death sentence, but the thought of navigating the treacherous 10-mile path in the pitch black was equally terrifying. I secured my father's blood-stained jacket inside my canvas bag and tightened the straps over my shoulders. My flashlight was my only lifeline, but I knew the beam would act like a beacon, signaling my exact location to the beast waiting in the dark. I took a deep breath, forcing my frozen legs to take the first step away from the rocky cliff face. The moment I began to walk, the atmosphere in the forest shifted entirely. The heavy, oppressive silence was broken by the sound of heavy foliage rustling high up on the ridge above me. He was out of the cave. He was no longer waiting. The slow, deliberate snapping of thick branches echoed through the freezing air, pacing my footsteps perfectly. The hunt had officially begun, and the darkest night of my life was just getting started. The walk through the pitch-black timber was an agonizing exercise in mental endurance. My flashlight cut a narrow, trembling cone of white light through the dense darkness, illuminating the freezing mist that poured from my mouth with every panicked breath. The temperature was hovering near a brutal 20 degrees, yet my heavy flannel shirt was completely soaked in a cold, nervous sweat. I knew he was following me. I did not need to see his massive, hulking frame to know he was pacing my exact movements. I could hear him walking on the elevated ridge parallel to my path, staying roughly 60 feet to my right, hidden entirely by the impenetrable curtain of thick brush and towering century-old pines. The sound of his footfalls was heavy, slow, and incredibly deliberate, each step crushing the dead undergrowth with an immense, terrifying force. He was not trying to hide his presence from me. He wanted me to know he was there, shadowing my every move, like a giant, malicious phantom haunting the tree line. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, navigating the uneven dirt trail that led back toward the distant outpost, terrified that if I turned my light toward the brush, I would see those glowing amber eyes staring back at me. This was purely psychological torture. He was an apex predator, capable of closing the distance between us in mere seconds. Yet he chose to stalk me slowly, letting the raw dread build up in my chest until I felt like my heart was going to burst. I tried to walk faster, pushing my burning leg muscles to their absolute limit. But no matter how quickly I hiked, the heavy footsteps in the woods perfectly matched my pace. After covering about 3 miles of grueling, steep terrain, the psychological warfare escalated to a horrifying new level. The path widened slightly, leading into a dense grove of ancient cedar trees where the canopy was so thick that not a single sliver of moonlight could penetrate the branches. The darkness here felt physically heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. Suddenly, the parallel footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was far worse than the sound of his heavy pursuit. It was thick, suffocating, and dripping with malicious intent. I paused, my chest heaving, and strained my ears to listen over the bitter wind. Without any warning, a massive, heavy object crashed onto the trail exactly 20 feet in front of me, kicking up a large cloud of frozen dirt and dead leaves. I aimed my flashlight at the impact zone, my hands shaking violently. It was a massive section of a rotting pine trunk, easily weighing over 150 pounds. He had thrown it with absolute precision from the top of the ridge, intending to block my path and assert his terrifying dominance. The sheer physical power required to hurl a log of that size through the dense timber was beyond human comprehension. He was playing a sadistic game, testing my reactions, observing how I handled the intense terror. I muttered a quiet, desperate prayer under my breath, my voice trembling in the freezing air, telling myself to just keep moving forward. I carefully stepped over the rotting wood, refusing to look up into the dark branches where I knew he was watching. The horrific stench of wet hair and decaying meat washed over me again in a nauseating wave, confirming he was dangerously close. The trail eventually forced me onto a treacherous, narrow stretch of ground that hugged the very edge of a deep ravine. On my left was a solid wall of jagged, freezing rock, and on my right was a sheer drop of at least 80 feet, into a black void of sharp stones and dead trees. I had to inch my way along the path, pressing my back against the cold stone, praying I would not lose my footing in the darkness. The freezing wind whipped through the canyon, cutting through my layers and chilling me straight to the bone. Because I was forced to move slowly, the creature seized the opportunity to aggressively close the distance. He abandoned the parallel ridge and descended into the heavy brush directly behind me. I could hear his massive, heavily clawed feet gripping the frozen earth, the distance between us shrinking rapidly with every second. The scent grew so potent that I had to breathe exclusively through my mouth to stop myself from vomiting on the trail. He was no longer trying to be subtle. The heavy, rhythmic breathing I had heard in the cave was now loud and echoing, just a few yards behind my back. I knew that if I panicked and tried to run on this narrow ledge, I would plummet to my death. I had to force myself to take calculated, steady steps, fighting the overwhelming biological urge to flee from the danger. He was deliberately putting pressure on me, pushing me toward a fatal mistake. The profound intelligence of his hunting strategy was what truly terrified me. He understood the extreme danger of the terrain and was using it entirely to his advantage. I finally cleared the dangerous ravine and stepped onto a wider, flat plateau covered in waist-high dead ferns. I turned around instantly, shining my flashlight back toward the narrow path, expecting him to be right on my heels, ready to strike, but the beam revealed nothing but empty space and blowing mist. My relief lasted only a fraction of a second before the heavy brush to my left violently parted. He charged. He did not come out fully into the open, but he rushed the edge of the tree line with terrifying speed, stopping just 10 feet away from the edge of my light. The force of his movement violently shook the smaller trees, and a low, guttural vibration rumbled deep from his chest, physically shaking the ground beneath my boots. It was a mock charge, a classic intimidation tactic used by dominant predators to establish absolute control over their environment. I froze completely, the metal flashlight shaking in my tight grip. For a brief, horrifying second, the beam caught his silhouette perfectly. He was standing entirely upright on two highly muscular legs, his broad shoulders easily 4 feet across. The dark, coarse hair covering his body absorbed the light, making him look like a solid mass of living shadow. His long, thick arms hung down past his waist, ending in massive hands tipped with thick, curved claws. The raw, aggressive energy radiating from him was utterly paralyzing. He stood there for a long moment, letting me absorb the truth of his sheer size and power before slowly taking a step back and melting seamlessly back into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. I fell to my knees in the frozen dirt, the adrenaline leaving my body in a sudden draining rush, making my limbs feel entirely like lead. I had hiked roughly 5 miles, but there were still 5 more grueling miles left before I reached the safety of the distant outpost. The temperature had dropped further to a dangerous 15 degrees, and the severe cold was biting deep into my joints. I clutched my heavy canvas bag, feeling the stiff, blood-stained fabric of my father's jacket hidden inside. The understanding of what was actually happening finally clicked in my exhausted mind. The dogman was not just stalking me for the simple thrill of the hunt. He was systematically herding me. Every thrown log, every mock charge, every heavy footfall in the dark was a calculated move to push me away from his mountain den and steer me in a specific direction. He was actively defending his territory, escorting the intruder out of his domain, but doing it in a manner that constantly asserted his absolute dominance. I was entirely at his mercy. If he wanted me dead, he would have dragged me into the underbrush miles ago. Instead, he wanted me to suffer, to experience the profound, soul-crushing fear of being hunted by something far superior. I forced myself to stand back up, my legs shaking violently against the biting cold wind. The night was far from over, and the deepest, darkest stretch of the timber still lay ahead. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, pointed it into the consuming blackness, and continued to walk, knowing the beast was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to escalate the terror. The deeper I pushed into the black timber, the heavier the atmosphere became, pressing against my chest until every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. The temperature had plummeted dangerously low, hovering around 10 degrees, and a thick, freezing mist began to roll through the massive trunks of the pine trees, severely limiting my visibility. I was exhausted, my muscles burning from the miles of treacherous hiking, but the sheer, unadulterated terror kept my legs moving forward. Then the absolute worst-case scenario happened. The heavy-duty flashlight in my right hand began to flicker. The bright, reassuring beam of white light dimmed into a weak, sickly yellow, pulsing irregularly against the darkness. I tapped the metal casing against my palm, begging the batteries to hold on, but the cold was draining their life rapidly. I was navigating a narrow, uneven trail bordered by a steep, rocky incline on one side and an impenetrable wall of dead thorn bushes on the other. I was entirely boxed in. As the light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the path, the heavy footsteps that had been shadowing me from the dense brush suddenly stopped. The silence that fell over the forest was absolute and suffocating. The wind died completely. The freezing mist seemed to hang suspended in the air. I stopped walking, my heart slamming against my ribs with such force that it physically hurt. The overwhelming stench of wet, decaying hair and rotting meat washed over me in a concentrated wave, so thick I could practically taste the copper tang of death in the back of my throat. He was no longer paralleling my path. He had moved ahead of me. I was walking directly into a trap. My flashlight gave one final weak pulse before dying completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. I stood frozen on the trail, my breathing shallow and rapid. Slowly, my eyes began to adjust to the gloom as the clouds above parted slightly, allowing a faint, pale sliver of moonlight to filter through the canopy. About 30 feet ahead of me, the heavy mist swirled and parted, and the massive silhouette of the dogman stepped directly into the center of the narrow path, completely blocking my only way forward. The sheer size of him in the open was incomprehensible. He stood fully upright, towering at least 9 feet tall, his massive head nearly brushing the lower branches of the ancient pines. His shoulders were impossibly broad, packed with hundreds of pounds of dense, aggressive muscle that shifted under a thick coat of coarse, matted black hair. But it was his face that truly shattered my mind. It was a terrifying amalgamation of a timber wolf and something sinisterly human. His snout was long and lined with jagged, razor-sharp teeth that glinted faintly in the dim moonlight, but his brow was heavy and pronounced, framing those glowing amber eyes. Those eyes held no mindless animal instinct. They possessed a dark, ancient intelligence, a profound and cruel understanding of the sheer terror he was inflicting upon me. He stared down at me with absolute contempt, his long, heavily clawed arms hanging relaxed at his sides. He knew I was completely powerless, trapped in his domain with nowhere to run and absolutely no way to fight back. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The tension in the freezing air was so thick it felt like physical pressure crushing my skull. I stood perfectly still, clutching the straps of my heavy canvas bag, knowing that a single sudden movement would trigger his predatory instinct to strike. Then he took a step forward. The ground vibrated under the immense weight of his footfall. He took another step, closing the distance between us with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. He stopped just outside of arm's reach, his massive frame blocking out the entire trail. The heat radiating from his massive body clashed with the freezing air, creating a faint steam that rose from his dark fur. The smell was completely unbearable up close, a nauseating combination of old blood and wild, untamed filth. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his massive head toward me. His nostrils flared as he took a deep, deliberate inhalation, tasting the air between us. My blood ran cold as I realized what he was doing. He was smelling the canvas bag strapped to my back. He was smelling the heavy, blood-stained fabric of my father's winter jacket hidden inside. A low, deep vibration began in his broad chest, a sound that resonated in my very bones, shaking the frozen earth beneath my boots. It was a sound of recognition. He remembered the man who wore that jacket 3 decades ago. He remembered tearing it from my father's body, and now he knew exactly who I was and why I had come into his woods. The psychological horror of that specific moment broke something deep inside my mind. I was standing face to face with the literal monster that had slaughtered my father, and I was completely at his mercy. He leaned his head down further until his massive snout was mere inches from my face. I could feel the intense, wet heat of his breath against my freezing skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears of pure terror and helpless grief freezing on my cheeks, fully expecting his massive jaws to clamp down on my neck and end my life right there on the dark trail. I braced myself for the agonizing pain, for the violent end in the freezing mud. But the strike never came. Instead, he simply stood there, letting his immense physical presence dominate my entire existence. This was the ultimate display of absolute power. He wanted me to know that my life belonged entirely to him, that he could extinguish it in a fraction of a second, but he was choosing not to. He was proving that human weapons, human intelligence, and human vengeance meant absolutely nothing in his territory. We were nothing more than fragile, temporary visitors in a dark, ancient world that he ruled completely. The fear was so profound, so absolute, that my legs finally gave out. I collapsed onto my knees in the frozen dirt, completely surrendering to the apex predator, waiting for him to decide my fate. I remained on my knees in the freezing mud, my head bowed in total submission, unable to look into his amber eyes any longer. The heavy, vibrating breathing continued above me for a few more agonizing seconds, acting as a final, terrifying warning etched into my memory. Then the massive presence slowly began to retreat. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, watching his huge clawed feet step backward, returning to the edge of the tree line. The heat radiating from his body slowly faded, replaced once again by the biting cold of the winter wind. I did not move a single muscle until I heard the heavy sound of branches snapping and the dead foliage being crushed as he walked away, disappearing back into the impenetrable darkness of the deep woods. He did not run. He walked away with the slow, confident stride of a king leaving his conquered subject behind. It took several minutes before I could find the strength to force myself back up onto my shaking feet. My entire body felt bruised, drained of every ounce of energy and willpower. I looked down the dark, empty trail leading toward the distant outpost. I had survived the climax of the nightmare, but I was still miles away from safety, carrying the bloody remnants of the past on my back. I gripped the straps of my bag, ignoring the freezing pain in my hands, and began the agonizing march forward, forever changed by the monster that haunted the dark corners of the world. I dragged my exhausted, freezing body through the thick mist, placing one heavy boot in front of the other purely on survival instinct. The remaining 3 miles to the outpost felt like navigating an entirely different planet. The temperature remained brutally low, locked at around 10 degrees, and every inhalation burned my lungs like inhaling frozen glass. My flashlight was completely dead, forcing me to rely entirely on the pale, sickly moonlight that barely penetrated the dense canopy of the ancient pines. I was walking completely blind through the most dangerous terrain in the Cascade Mountains. The terrifying silence of the forest was no longer a comforting blanket of nature. It was a suffocating, heavy void that constantly threatened to swallow me whole. Every single shadow stretching across the narrow dirt path looked exactly like his towering, 9-foot-tall silhouette. The phantom scent of wet, decaying hair and ancient earth seemed to cling to the inside of my nose, a permanent reminder of the massive apex predator that owned the dark. I constantly fought the overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, terrified that if I turned my head, I would see those glowing, highly intelligent amber eyes staring back at me from the thick brush. My hands were completely numb, locked in a rigid grip around the thick straps of my heavy canvas bag. Inside that bag was the blood-stained jacket of my father, the absolute confirmation of his violent end. The physical pain of the freezing cold and the intense muscle fatigue were completely overshadowed by the psychological torture of knowing the monster was still out there, entirely capable of changing his mind and ending my life before I ever reached the safety of 4 walls. After hours of agonizing, slow progress through the treacherous terrain, the dense tree line finally began to thin out. Through the swirling grey mist, I spotted the faint flickering glow of a solitary kerosene lantern cutting through the pitch-black night. It was the outpost. There were no paved roads here, no modern amenities, and absolutely no vehicles to offer a quick escape. It was simply a rugged, isolated wooden shelter built for hikers and off-grid wanderers to survive the brutal winter nights. I pushed my burning legs into a heavy jog, desperately closing the final few hundred feet until I slammed my shoulder against the heavy wooden door, pushing it open and throwing myself inside. The sudden absence of the biting wind caused me to collapse onto the dusty floorboards. I was entirely alone in the small room. I dragged myself into the corner, pressing my back against the solid timber wall, and pulled my knees to my chest. My entire body shook violently, a combination of severe hypothermia and the massive drop in adrenaline. With trembling, numb fingers, I unbuckled my canvas bag and slowly pulled out my father's ruined jacket. In the dim, amber light of the outpost lantern, the sheer brutality of the attack was undeniable. The thick fabric was shredded by massive, precise claw marks that easily sliced through the heavy material as if it were nothing but thin paper. The dark, dried blood told a story of absolute dominance and terrifying violence. My father, a master of the deep woods, never stood a chance against the sheer, overwhelming power of that beast. I sat in the dusty corner of that isolated shelter and wept, grieving not just for the loss of my father, but for the horrifying truth of how he spent his final moments on earth. The following morning, I began the long, grueling hike out of the mountains and back toward the edges of civilization. The transition from the terrifying ancient wilderness back to the bustling streets of Seattle was a jarring, deeply alienating experience. I walked among thousands of people, completely surrounded by towering buildings of glass and steel, Yet I felt entirely isolated from humanity. I never went to the authorities with my findings. I never turned over the shredded jacket or reported the massive footprints in the mud. The explanation was simple. They would never believe the truth. The authorities crave neat, comfortable explanations. They would write off the claw marks as the work of a mountain lion or some other standard wild animal. They would refuse to acknowledge the existence of a 9-foot-tall, bipedal canine monster with the dark intelligence of a human being. Taking the jacket to them would only result in closed doors and sympathetic, condescending looks. So, I kept the secret. I locked the jacket away in a secure chest in my basement, a permanent physical anchor to the most terrifying night of my life. Carrying this profound knowledge alone is a heavy, suffocating burden. When you experience something that completely shatters the established boundaries of nature, you can never look at the world the same way again. I walk through the safe, brightly lit streets of the city, but my mind is constantly pulled back to that freezing, pitch-black trail in the Cascades, forever trapped in the shadow of the apex predator. Decades have passed since that night, but the psychological scars remain completely fresh and highly sensitive. I have never returned to the deep woods, and I refuse to step foot anywhere near a dense tree line after the sun begins to set. The trauma completely rewired my brain. I suffer from severe night terrors, waking up in cold sweats, my heart hammering against my ribs because I swear I can hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing echoing from the dark corners of my bedroom. The fear of the dark is no longer an irrational childhood phobia. It is a profound, deeply ingrained survival instinct. The most terrifying aspect of the entire ordeal is the reflection on why the creature allowed me to leave his territory alive. He possessed the speed to catch me, the immense strength to destroy me, and the perfect isolated environment to hide my remains forever. Yet, he chose to let me walk away. It was a calculated display of absolute supremacy. He wanted a witness. He wanted me to carry the heavy terror of his existence back to the safe, arrogant world of humanity. We build our concrete cities and illuminate our streets, falsely believing we have conquered the natural world. But the deep, ancient timber does not belong to us. It belongs to them. The Dogman is the absolute ruler of the shadows, a living nightmare that demands complete submission from anything that dares to cross into his domain. I'm sharing this confession now because the silence has become entirely too heavy to carry alone. People need to understand that the warnings passed down through generations are not simply scary campfire tales invented to frighten children. They are vital survival instructions based on terrifying, undeniable facts. If you ever find yourself walking through the deep woods and the natural sounds of the forest suddenly vanish, if the temperature abruptly drops and a sickening stench fills the air, you must turn around immediately. Do not investigate. Do not assume you are safe. You have crossed a boundary that you were never meant to cross, and you are standing in the presence of an ancient, malicious force that views you as nothing more than prey. Thank you for listening to my story. The dark corners of this world hold secrets that are entirely capable of breaking the human mind. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on these terrifying encounters. Drop a comment below and let me know how you would have handled locking eyes with the absolute apex predator of the woods. Share this video with anyone who loves scary stories and encounters with dogmen. This is Mr. Nightmare Scares You, reminding you to always lock your doors, respect the deep woods, and never assume you are alone in the dark. Good night, and stay safe.